And now to our main event. I was a little bit tripped up on how to introduce Eric tonight because I thought, Eric Eggers, best on corruption, or Eric Eggers, corruption expert. It seemed like that could be interpreted two ways, right? I didn't want to make you guys think he was a big slime bag. So let me tell you a little bit about how he spends his time. He's a researcher and a reporter working with the famed investigative and journalist and best-selling author Peter Schweizer. I think you've heard of Clinton Cash and Secret Empires, yeah? Eric actually worked as a researcher on those projects, and they work at the Government Accountability Institute, which was founded to do deep investigative journalism, you know, the kind of stuff that the news channels used to do in the old days. Right? This requires a healthy skepticism of official statements, a disregard for narratives, and I know we are all really, really getting tired of the narratives, right? They follow the money, they take great pains to rigorously fact-check their findings, and they don't take any anonymous sources. They don't use them. So Eric co-hosts this incredible podcast called, it's a must-listen in my mind, it's called The Drill Down, and they deliver news on cronyism, corruption, the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. He reports on all kinds of corruption, including that of Big Pharma, green energy, teachers' union, the misleading the names of bills, the enriching of lobbyists, and of course the endless relationships that always seem to lead back to China. It goes on and on. But what is so delightful is that Eric and Peter, as they explore corruption, which is not exactly a cheerful subject, manage to laugh. And their wit and insight make for a great and worthwhile listen. I hope you'll check out The Drill Down if you don't know it already. Eric's 2018 film, The Creepy Line, revealed how companies like Facebook and Google use their near ubiquitous influence to profoundly affect electoral outcomes in favor of their preferred candidates. And his 2018 book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election, he not only exposed voter fraud and its organizing, but pretty much predicted the dynamics for 2020. He's a he's a contributor to Prager University videos and also a former radio producer and talk show host. Eric has 4 children, and what I'm thinking about those children is it's going to be tough because they will not be able to get away with, when they get old enough to be clever teenagers, they're not going to be able to get away with much because Eric is a cheerful, though relentless exposure of deception. So I introduce you tonight to the Vice President of the Government Accountability Institute, Eric Eggers.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, all of you, for being here and being part of the freedom movement. I live in Florida, and my brother actually lives in the Bay Area, and so just for the last 3 years, for us to be able to kind of compare what our lived realities were has been astounding. So I cannot empathize with what the last several years have been like for you, but I can certainly sympathize. And what I think the last 3 years have exposed to us is just what the government is capable of, the impact it can have on our lives, and the reason why we have to make sure that the forces and incentive structures that shape those government policies are as honest, and the people that we elect to make those decisions actually represent their honest constituencies. So I'm excited to be here tonight and talk to you a little bit about kind of my journey as an investigative journalist working for the Government Accountability Institute, and some of the research I've been involved in, some of the things you've heard of, some of the things you haven't, and what I think it means for the next few months and beyond. So I'm excited to be with you as somebody that works to expose and hopefully promote the cause of freedom. I'm also, as Jane noted, the father of 4 children, and so as the father of 4 children whose mom has to put them to bed tonight, I'm excited to be with you right here. This is like where I want to be, okay? So, no, but we'll have a good time. So, and I'm also like very proud because let's be honest, like Jane listens to my podcast, but does anybody else actually listen to the podcast? Probably not. And so, does anybody actually know who I am? And like, so why are you here to listen to this guy who you've never heard of? And so what it tells me is that you're A, like that committed to, the cause of freedom, B, got dragged here by a friend, or C, as I see the crowd is older, you'd already seen tonight's rerun of Matlock. So either way, just welcome, and we're glad that you're here. So, no, but who I am, as Jane noted, I'm an author, I'm a film producer, I am a podcast host. 2018 was kind of crazy for me. So I started working for the Government Accountability Institute 10 years ago, and I've been involved in political corruption, and I'll talk a little bit about the various projects I've been involved in, but two of the things that I did came out in 2018. One was this book called Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election, and the other was a film that I produced called The Creepy Line, which was about the impact that Google and Facebook specifically could have on shaping American elections. So in the film, we talked about the power that Google and Facebook have to, in an unseen way, manipulate American behavior and therefore political outcomes. In the film, we actually exposed something called the search engine manipulation effect. Now, does anybody know what that is? Yeah, what is it, ma'am? So very close. So search engine manipulation effect, right? So it's actually a term invented by a Harvard-trained psychologist named Robert Epstein, and he actually trained under B.F. Skinner. And he conducted experiments, and what he found is that when you type in search engine terms, then the ranking of the results of those terms can shift political opinion by up to 30%. And most specifically, it can shift political opinion with one group of voters like more pronounced than any other group. Independent voters. So let's just say you searched for Hillary Clinton, and Google decides to put 4 positive stories above 1 negative story. And then you search for Donald Trump, and you put 4 negative stories about Donald Trump ahead of a positive story. That absolutely, in Dr. Epstein's research, proved ways in which that can shift independent voters and who they're going to decide to vote for. Now, that was in 2018. And in my book, Fraud, which I'll talk about, we talked about how it didn't used to be a controversial topic, that if there's a bipartisan commission, that there's absolutely one way to conduct an election that is the least secure possible, and that is via mail-in ballots. There were commissions headed by Jimmy Carter, and people wrote decisions in 2005. The New York Times wrote about this. This was not a controversial thing. So I wrote a book and produced a film that talked about American elections being susceptible and vulnerable. And then 2020 happened. And I absolutely could not have predicted the things, that the confluence of the relationship and merger between big tech and the vulnerabilities that were already baked in and fought for by liberal interests in American elections, and how those two combined to provide the least secure and, I think, least representative of a true democratic outcome election in American history, while we were told the opposite was true, right? We were told, hey, America's election 2020 was the most secure in American history, which is laughable, except for no one's laughing. So we'll talk about a little bit of the things that helped lead to that, and unfortunately why I think next month might not be any better, at least initially. And so we'll get into that. But first, I just wanted to talk briefly about who and what we do at the Government Accountability Institute. One of the things we do right now, and there's a reason why we do this podcast, is we do a podcast every week called The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer. So if you are someone that consumes media via your phone, or if you consume podcasts, I would love it if you guys would go to the website, thedrilldown.com, download it. That's actually why I'm here, is to promote the podcast. I'm here to promote the podcast and to see my newborn niece for the first time. And so I appreciate you guys giving me you guys say, "Aw," you're not even the 10th of it. She is adorable, okay? Her name is Rivers, and I got uncle points for being here, and I got husband points because I got paid to be here. Like, I'm killing it right now, okay? So it would really help me if you guys would also download and listen to the Drill Down podcast as well. That's one thing we do. But the fact that we've had to launch a podcast at the Government Accountability Institute is in and of itself a bit of a scandal and a bit of a story. Because we actually, over the last decade, have been involved in and even have caused some of the most important stories in American political history. But we now exist in a media environment in which we have a harder time getting our message out. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. So as somebody that's worked for a decade at the Government Accountability Institute with Peter Schweizer, we're a nonprofit based in Tallahassee, Florida, which is where I live. We primarily have historically worked on books that Peter Schweizer has written, and Jane touched on it. The reason why we actually were founded a decade ago is because some smart people said, hey, let's think about what's happening in newsrooms right now. In fact, I was at dinner earlier with someone who'd worked with McClatchy Media Services, and his job was to help them raise more money by selling their real estate. Think about what media companies have done. Has the size of media, traditional media newsrooms, gone up or down? Down, like not even close, right? Like dramatically down. Some people are like, what's a newsroom? It's just some kid on a couch with a Twitter account, right? And so we said, okay, well, necessarily then, that means that news organizations will have less time and resources to devote to independent and arduous investigative journalism. So what we will do is we will do that journalism. As a nonprofit, we will accept donations, we will hire staff, we will hire investigative researchers, we will hire forensic accountants, and then we will look into federal government corruption and cronyism on all sides of the aisles. And then what we will do is then we will partner with media entities to place our research. We'll give it to you, say, hey, 60 Minutes, this is yours. Hey, New York Times, this is yours. But we just want the brand and like the story of the political corruption out there. We want it exposed. We want the bad actors to stop, and we want the corruption to end. That's what we were invented to do. And we did it very successfully for a while. These are 3 books that we sort of came out of the gate with. The first is Throw Them All Out. Peter Schweizer is kind of a nerd, and what he did is he was reading this economic journal one time, and he said, hey, there's some different trends for different professions and how they tend to do with their portfolios in the stock market. Is anybody here a financial advisor? Anybody work in the financial sector? They're like, after the last couple weeks, I'm not admitting it if I am, okay? So I don't want my clients to talk to me about their performance right now. I don't blame you. But what this economic journal showed, because the cool thing about transparency is that's the best weapon we have to expose political corruption. So because members of Congress have to report their financial transactions, we can see how they've done and how their stock trades have done and how their portfolios have done over time. And what this economic journal found was that members of Congress outperformed the market by 15%, while professional stockbrokers outperformed the market by like 2%, which is maybe another reason why the stockbrokers didn't want to admit that they're in this profession tonight, right? So, so members of Congress are either like way smarter than professionals in the financial sector, or they had a leg up. And what we exposed and Throw Them All Out was that leg up was that members of Congress were buying and selling and trading stocks in the industries that their positions allowed them to not only oversee, but attend meetings that had inside information. And there was no law against it. I like the fake exasperation. I want that energy all night. So, yeah. So these guys were killing it. And so we wrote this book, and we gave it to 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes, Steve Kroft asked Nancy Pelosi about it during a press gaggle, and she was embarrassed because she was getting access to Visa IPOs while she's overseeing the financial sector. I mean, it's scandalous, right? The kids would say it's scandalous AF. And so it's, if you don't know what it means, ask someone younger and without a potty mouth. So the point is, so they asked that, right? And the coolest thing happened. They actually passed a law to stop it. It was called, unironically, the Stock Act, Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge. And so it actually helped force disclosure requirements. It did some really positive things for a couple years. And then it was gutted in the middle of the night because congressional staff had actually been exposed to it as well, and they sort of complained. But that's an example of a thing we did, expose federal government corruption. We partnered with a mainstream media outlet like 60 Minutes, and we got it out there, and we actually saw some good come of it. We also did this book, Extortion, which has essentially exposed how members of Congress leveraged their positions of authority to extort money and raise funds, both for their political accounts but also their personal accounts, from the constituents that they regulated and oversaw. So is anybody here a member of like a country club? So you know how like if it used to be the case where if you owed money to your country club dues, they would put sheets up on the wall like, hey, you know, Jenkins, and you owe like $300 as a way of sort of shaming you into doing that. So when you're in Congress, members of Congress actually have fundraising requirements based on the committees that they're assigned to. If you're in the Financial Services Committee, it's called an A committee. And so you're expected to raise a much larger amount of money. Do you know what D committees are? The committees that you're on in which you're expected to raise the least amount of money? Veterans. Because they don't feel like you can raise money by extorting veterans. So what we did, one of the things that I did in that book is we got the fundraising list of each member of Congress for Democrats and Republicans and exposed just how much money they had to raise based on other things. There's lots of other scandalous stuff in there, people taking money from congressional their political campaigns, and they're using it to fund weddings and golf trips and everything else. But once again, we partnered with 60 Minutes. They did a whole special on it, exposed one lady, and actually it was from California, had lent herself money, had lent her campaign money from her private account, and the laws allow you to do this, charged her campaign 18% interest. So she was making 18% off of money that she was getting from her own political campaign. And the guy's talking to her about it, and she's like, well, look, look at the market. I mean, so she had no excuse. Steve Cross exposed her. It was great television. So we did that. Fast forward a couple years, Clinton Cash. So has anybody read the book Clinton Cash? There's also a film, Clinton Cash. If you've seen that, I produced the film as well. So what Clinton Cash is about is this nexus of interests between when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and Bill Clinton was a former president, and they ran their Clinton Foundation. And so we looked at the overlap of people that either donated to the Clinton Foundation or paid for Bill Clinton to give a speech while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Because it's sort of an unprecedented arrangement in American history, right? You have someone whose job it is to be the international liaison to the rest of the world on behalf of this country, who also has a organization that accepts money from people from around the rest of the country, and or the rest of the world, and oh, by the way, her husband, who's a former president, will accept like six-figure donations to give a speech from some of these groups that also want business from that Department of State. Like, it was a mess, right? We called it the Clinton blur. I actually traveled to Haiti as part of the research for that book, because as you may or may not know, the Clintons, both Hillary and Bill, were singularly in charge of the reconstruction of Haiti after the earthquake. Hillary was Secretary of State, Bill was special envoy to the United Nations, and what we found is that while for regular Haitians, life pretty much stayed the same after the earthquake, friends of Bill Clinton, people that paid for his speeches, people that ran Haitian cell phone companies, their business took off, partly because of policies enacted by Hillary's Department of State. So that's one of the things we exposed in the film. The other thing, just is a fun fact, Bill Clinton has only ever given 11 speeches in his post-presidential career for which he was paid $500,000 or more. Of the 11 speeches, guess how many of them came when Hillary was Secretary of State? You guys are blowing it for me. Not 11, I'm sorry, that's disappointing. It's 9, but it's still impressive, right? 9 of the 11 so like what that means is either Bill got a lot smarter or became more eloquent, or you're paying Bill Clinton to give a speech for some other reason. And that's one of the things that we exposed in that film. So then kind of a crazy thing happens. We produced this film, and a gentleman who was actually the co-founder of our organization, the Government Accountability Institute, leaves our organization and joins the Trump campaign in the summertime of, right when the Clinton Cash film came out. It was this guy. Oh, excuse me, I'll get to that in a second. Not this guy, not this guy. Okay, so here's the point. The point of the reporting in Clinton Cash is this. We had all these findings in Clinton Cash. we then said, hey, like this is what we have, but we know this is an unprecedented deal. We know Hillary is a candidate for office. So we want you guys to sort of authenticate it, vet it yourselves. So we literally gave this information to the New York Times. That's a story from ABC News, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, and other news outlets. And they all reported on it, okay? They all reported on it. So Clinton Cash became the #2 New York Times bestseller, and it was validated by every mainstream media outlet you can think of. Like they all reported on it. It became a big deal. Peter Schweizer's next book actually became #1, and it was a book called Secret Empires. Has anybody heard of Secret Empires? Okay. Now, Secret Empires, man, we are so close to getting this thing to work. So, anyway, Secret Empires was #1, and it was actually ignored by all media outlets, okay? Now, Secret Empires came out in 2018, and it actually features, for the first time we reported on the business arrangements of somebody called Hunter Biden with Ukrainian natural gas companies Burisma and with this Chinese investment fund. So we sort of introduced the character of Hunter Biden to the rest of the country in 2018. And it was ignored. The only people that do any media coverage of it was Fox News, actually. And for a stretch, we couldn't even do Fox News because we had reporting, as you can see on the cover, with Mitch McConnell and Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, who runs a shipping company, right, her biggest client is China. And so, but Elaine Chao didn't like, she was a prominent Republican, she called up people at Fox News, and so we sort of got a timeout, if you like, from Fox News. But this book actually became #1. But the point is the trend had started. It was now okay to ignore relevant reporting by mainstream media outlets. And I just think it's kind of an interesting story that you'll appreciate. The reason why it was ignored is in part for a very fascinating reason. But here's what's cool about this. This story, like the mainstream media ignored it until Donald Trump was impeached. Do you remember why Donald Trump was impeached? Which time? I know, it's a great question, Bart. The first time he was impeached because they said he abused his power because he was on the phone with the Ukrainian president asking about the potential of investigating the allegations about Hunter Biden, which is information that was first reported in our book, Secret Empires. So the crazy thing about the Government Accountability Institute and us small little nonprofit in Tallahassee is our information, because they would read from Clinton Cash during Trump's campaign, and Steve Bannon left to go join Trump's campaign. So like our information was used to both get Donald Trump elected and get Donald Trump impeached. And so, and that's just the reality of like, but it shows you what happens when you can report real things, like impact can happen, okay? So then the question becomes, well, that information was so relevant, so why was it ignored? And it's because, and I already said this guy's name, this guy. Do you guys know who this guy is? Steve. So listen, okay, hey, he did try to get me fired one time, but that was like a decade ago. So no, I love Steve. I love Steve. But here's the deal. So this is the crazy stuff about at least 2 shirts and 4 pens. So in the pockets. No, Steve's crazy. So this is what happened. So I sort of understand the inclination. So he leaves and he joins the Trump campaign, and they win, okay? So now he is feeling like very good about himself. And I'm familiar with the concept. So we did the film Clinton Cash. We actually screened it at the Cannes Film Festival. So and I don't know if you know about the Cannes Film Festival, but do you know where you primarily party at the Cannes Film Festival? You guys this is Silicon Valley, bro. We're not impressed. I'm sorry. But yeah, so at the Cannes Film Festival, you tend to party on yachts. And so one night, I've been on this yacht, and I've got like major yacht party, Cannes Energy Film Festival energy, and we go to dinner. And we're in France, and I actually studied a lot of French when I was in school. So I was like, I got us, guys. I'm going to dinner with like Steve Bannon, Dave Bossy, a few other people. And so we go to the restaurant, and I decided to practice my French. And I was like, bienvenue, je voudrais le beefsteak, s'il vous plaît, une tasse de thé. And the waitress, who's like thoroughly unimpressed, is like, just order in English, please. Like, so I know what it looks like to kind of like feel like you're at one level and then there'd be some, not positive consequences as a result. So that's kind of what happened to Steve. So he gets elected, Donald Trump gets elected, and then our media strategy of giving all this information to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to Bloomberg and ABC News. Steve gives an interview to a guy named Joshua Green with Bloomberg. And he sort of describes our media strategy. And you can look this interview up and you can discuss it. And he tells everyone what we called it, which was anchor left, pivot right. And what that means is that we would give our information to these left-leaning media outlets. And that's how we anchored it. It was like product placement, right? We'll give this to you, and then it doesn't become our information. It becomes the New York Times' information or the Washington Post's information. Well, once he talked about it, guess how interested mainstream media outlets were in reporting on anything we had to say after that. Because they felt like they'd been used and they had been exposed and sort of this pawns, and they helped get Donald Trump elected. And like Donald Trump to them was like the most egregious existential threat to American democracy the world had ever seen. So because the threat was so great, any action they wanted to take would be validated. And that included now ignoring anything anybody who was associated with Steve Bannon or Donald Trump had to say. And so we basically no longer have a working relationship with mainstream media outlets. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why we started the podcast, is because we had to. Because now as things have evolved, you have to create your own platform, your own channels to get your message out. And that is one of the things that we've done. But the other thing that happened because of Donald Trump's election is we heard a lot of talk about the idea of voter fraud. And so Donald Trump says, yeah, it was close, but I've seen reports that I should have won by another 8 million votes, and we're hearing all these kind of stories. And so we said, well, hey, we like to, with the Government Accountability Institute, we always like to follow truth. Let's see where the facts take us. And so we began reporting on just what do American elections look like, how secure are they, how accurate are they. And we worked with a data scientist and commercial vendors to try to cross-reference voter rolls and vote tallies. And we bought as many votes as we could from the 2016 election, like not in the way politicians buy votes, but we bought access to the voter rolls to see what we could see. And so we actually came out with this report called America the Vulnerable, The Problem of Duplicate Voting. And we issued this report, and you can find this on the internet. And what the report showed was that in the home state of Florida that I live in, and you guys may remember that there was an election that was decided in Florida by not too many votes. You guys remember that? I'm old enough to remember that. I feel like most of you are also. Yeah, hang it. You said the guy with the magnifying glass and all. It was like Florida was an embarrassment, right? Florida was. And what a bad time to be called Chad at that time, right? So what we found is. So the Florida election, the presidential election in the year 2000 was swung by 537 votes, right? So what we found is in 2016, over 2,100 people in the state of Florida cast more than one ballot, meaning they cast a ballot in the state of Florida, and they cast a second ballot in a different state. So what we took away from that is a couple things, but number one is like, hey, don't say voter fraud can't be impactful and can't make a difference if we've just discovered from one basic analysis that 4 times the number of votes that swung a presidential election in this century were fraudulently cast in 2016, just by looking at one state. By the way, part of the reason why that happens, it's people like you guys, and this is what I mean by that. Because I would talk to people who, you can cast a ballot in 2 states if you are registered to vote in more than one state, right? So do you know why people are registered to vote in more than one state? Because they are registered in a state and then they move to another state and they don't tell the people that they are no longer registered to take me off the voter rolls. And I remember talking to a guy, I was actually a conservative news radio host, and he was saying, he's like, well, yeah. He's like, why would I tell that state I moved? It's none of their business. So it's just like this conservative principle to not want to know. But anyway, we wrote this report. And then we said, hey, we obviously have over 2,000. This is what we got. And then actually a publisher reached out to us and said, hey, love the report. Would you guys be interested in doing a book on this? And so since I'm kind of the guy that gets stuck with all these tasks. It's like, Eggers, write the book. So I did. And that's how this book, How the Left Plans to Steal the Election, came out. Now, if you haven't read it, and judging by my royalty checks, you haven't, like, my brother likes to say, he's like, I don't want to say your book is a failure. He goes, but if you go on Amazon and you look up your book, it says customers also bought a rope and a stool. So that's the kind of relationship I have with my brother. So I hate that his line got the best laugh tonight. So the point is, we looked into all these dynamics. And so essentially why we call it like how the left plans to steal the next election is a couple different things. The biggest problem with America's elections and the reason why they're still vulnerable to fraud is because of the voter rolls, right? There's two reasons. Number one, the rolls stay wildly inaccurate. And number two, any kind of common sense election integrity measures are fought against and struck down by liberal courts, liberal judges, liberal secretaries of state at every level, right? And it's actually funded, and this is why we call it the plot or the plan to steal the next election. Both things are funded by a guy named George Soros, right? His money fights to keep voter rolls inaccurate. Like the Supreme Court actually cited statistics from the Pew Center when they did an analysis of national voter rolls. And the voter rolls said that 24 million, the Pew Center, cited by the Supreme Court, 24 million voter registrations in this country. That's 1 in 8. So 24 million voter registrations are inaccurate or totally wrong, right? And then so I was like, well, if we know they're wrong, then how come we don't do anything about it? And the reason is that because a guy named Mark Elias and other liberal legal groups like that fight at every turn to keep states like Indiana has tried to do, like Ohio has done. Hey, how come California hasn't tried to do it? That's a joke. So they try to keep them from actually doing anything to improve the quality of the voter rolls, right? Now you might be saying, okay, well, just because the voter rolls are inaccurate, like how big of a deal is that? How easy is it to exploit it? And that's actually a question that undercover detectives in New York attempted to figure out the answer to, and this is in the book as well. And so what New York officials said is like, hey, we got these rolls for this local election that we know is not going to be close. And so they found 63 names in these local municipal elections that we know shouldn't be on there because they've either moved or they're in prison or they're dead or something like that. And so they sent undercover agents to try to cast ballots on behalf of these 63 names that shouldn't be on the voter rolls. I'm not going to ask you guys a question again because you're going to blow it again. But the point is, of the 63 attempts to cast a ballot, 61 of them were successful. You win. 61 of them were successful. And the reason why it wasn't 62 is because of the 2 times that weren't successful, the person was trying to cast a ballot on behalf of someone who was in prison, and that person's mother happened to be working the polling place. So you might be occasionally disappointed in some of your children, just like you've never been that disappointed, right? That you stopped voter fraud because of your felon son. So, but yeah, so the point is like, so the inaccuracies are easily exploited. And then what happens is the same people that fund the lawyers fund these activist groups like Acorn and La Raza and other groups to go out and gather up as many voting names and many ballots as possible, right? And they sort of like, it doesn't matter if they're accurate or not, and then they funnel all the ballots through these holes that the lawyers fight to keep open. And so that's the general premise of the book that I wrote in 2018, and that's what we call it, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Okay? So that's what happened, and it came out in 2018, and it got some attention. In Florida, the governor's race was very close, and it came out that we had some allegations of fraud there. So we got some media attention, but by and large, not a ton. Okay? And then, in fact, but the attention it did get wasn't overly positive. So what happens, has anybody ever here wanted to write a book? Yeah, so actually we're talking about this at dinner. So here's a secret. It's one thing to write a book. It's another thing to sell it. And so That's not another joke at my failure. But the point is that like to sell the book, you have to create news, and you want to try to figure out. So my book comes out in August of 2018, and they're like, okay, we'll come up with a news hook that you can do something to point out. And this actually is a really important point, because the way we talked about voter fraud in 2018 is very different than the way we talk about voter fraud now. And that's actually part of the reason why I'm worried for what's going to happen next month. And this story, I think, underscores that. So my book comes out in 2018, and there was a special election in Ohio that same week, and it was very close. And so we did an analysis of the voter rolls of the voters for that election in Ohio. And what we found is that, like, while the election was incredibly close, there were actually hundreds of voters in that district who, according to their official voter registration records, their age would have been 115 years old, okay? And so, now obviously those people are not really 115 years old, but the point is, if voter registration errors and inaccuracies are the big problem with how illegal votes get cast, then let's just have an honest assessment of what that looks like. And so I wrote an article and said, hey, 115 people, however many people have an age that would make them probably dead. So then that article was cited by other news outlets, kind of less reputable, and they said, massive allegations of voter fraud, proof of voter fraud, like 115 dead people voted in this Ohio special election. And so everybody in Ohio was like, what? No, it's not true. And so this is from PolitiFact. So like, my book's out like a week. I got asked to write this book, and now I'm getting called a liar by PolitiFact. And so because of something other people wrote, right? And so it made me very sensitive to knowing how to talk about voter fraud and election integrity in ways that I think are backed up by evidence, and then ways that are not. And that's kind of one of my big takeaways for us today, is be informed consumers and know what seems to be legitimate and what's not. Now, the good news is I did get a correction. So we said, hey, PolitiFact, like, don't be throwing me under the bus. Like, it's these other people you got. And so they actually did issue a correction. You can find this as well. So, but that was sort of a terrifying thing, like my first entry into investigative reporting, my first book, and I'm being called a liar by PolitiFact. And so it was a challenging moment, but it really sort of helped me understand the need to be precise in terms of how we talk about the findings related to these issues. Okay? So then what happens? COVID hits. Now, you all, how many people have been in the Bay Area through the entirety of the COVID era? You're like, yeah, because they won't let us leave, right? Yeah. And so I was in Florida, and you know, this is kind of a weird thing. So like I and my family, because we could in Florida and because we have small children and we wanted to try to make just the most normal experience for them as possible, we actually just did all the things, right? Like I traveled a ton. I went to sporting events. I actually went to a World Series game in Dallas when they had the World Series there, which if you guys don't know, like sporting events during the COVID era are the best time to go to sporting events. There is no line for the bathroom, right? You can just be in there. But I was actually at a basketball game. Florida State, which is the university where I live, was playing the University of Florida. And there was like very few people at this game. And it was early tip, and I was there with my son and my family. And actually, this sort of tragic thing happened that a player for the University of Florida basketball team collapsed during the game. He was out of a timeout. He just fell straight down onto the ground. And it was like everyone was like screaming, crying. I actually had my mother take my son out into the hallway because like we don't know what's about to happen, right? Like we don't know, like the paramedics are gonna come, put the paddles on, they're gonna do mouth to mouth. Like, it could be a tragic thing. The player ended up being okay, ironically, because in the crowd of a very diminished COVID era crowd happened to be a cardiologist who's a basketball fan. She recognized that what happened was a cardiac event. She's able to tell the sports trainers, like, you have to let me do this now. And so she's actually able to save his life in the thing, which is an amazing story. But, sure. Oh, she's right. By the way, her name is Nancy Marcus. She's a female cardiologist. And he actually, I mean, it's a truly remarkable story. But while she was saving his life, the rest of the people in the arena had no idea what to do. The players were crying, right? The coaches were consulting with the referees, like, do we still play this game? Like, what do we do? And it was dead silent in the arena. And then all of a sudden, because the DJ was like, well, I don't know what to do, so the DJ starts playing, like, does what he normally does. So it's dead silent. We don't know if the guy's dead in the hallway. And all of a sudden you start hearing, apple bottom jeans, like this rap song comes on. And it was like the most awkward thing in the world. And it eventually kind of keeps playing, and he's like, okay, this is not the move. So he like lowers it, the volume, and then he turns it off, and then it's awkward again. And so that was like a thing that happened that I witnessed during COVID. And I tell that story because I think it's like the perfect metaphor for how we responded as a country, right? Like this crazy thing happened, this dangerous thing. We don't know if somebody's alive or dead, and we kind of don't know how to react. And so some people are going to sit there and cry, and some people are just going to start playing music and moving on, and everyone else is just in this awkward space. And the point is that of all the bad choices you could make, which that DJ made a bad choice, the way we decided to conduct our elections in 2020 was an even worse choice. Because what you did is you took every negative condition, everything that was vulnerable and made American elections like rife for exploitation, and you just put them on steroids and you served them up on a platter for any group that was motivated to take advantage of it. And that's exactly what happened. Okay? We could have been doing a lot better things. Like we could have, if we had invested earlier on in election technology, like there are Baltic states, like Latvia conducts elections via blockchain technology on their smartphones. There are good ways to do elections. In the United States, we don't do it. And that's partly because we've had other priorities. If anybody has listened to, like instead of investing in election technology, we have spent heavily to arm our federal government. I don't know if you saw the fact that we were getting, I think, 87,000 new IRS agents. And, let me tell you who's not excited about that other than Hunter Biden, me, right? So, so IRS agents, we've spent $700,000 worth of bullets. Open the Books, who I think will speak to you next week, they did an investigation. They spent between 2006 and 2014, $1.4 billion to arm non-military members of the federal government and give them arrest capacity, right? And it's a scandalous thing because it's like Glock. The gun maker Glock has 117 contracts with the federal government. So it's like good for Glock because, hey, we got the client, right? They got the money to spend. So there are now more armed members of the federal government who have arrest authority and firearm capacity who aren't like the military than the U.S. Marine Corps. There's 180,000 active duty Marines. There are 200,000 federal officials like EPA agents in camo, right? I mean, it's insane. The point is that's an example of stuff we've invested in as a country rather than investing in election technology and making sure American elections are more secure, okay? And we actually did a podcast on that recently, which I'm happy to talk about. So instead of having like cool stuff, we did this. We just had stacks and stacks and stacks of ballots. But the real scandal, I think, wasn't just that we conducted more votes via the least secure way in American history. It's that we lost the sanctity of political sterility. Now, that's a lot of syllables. What does that mean? Like, when you go to the polling place and you cast your ballot in the booth, is anybody in there with you? No. In fact, there's laws against it, right? And there's laws against anybody being able to be within 500 yards of you while you do that, okay? That all changed in 2020. We not only permitted, California became the first state to legalize ballot harvesting, which is the third-party people that can go out and collect it, right? So ballot harvesting now became kind of de facto legal. And the political interference of these operatives that can go out and help deliver your ballot, collect your ballot, and then put it in the polling place for you, like that changed. So we now have less confidence the vote that was cast actually reflects the true intent of the voter who received that ballot, because you have more people involved in the process. Like if I want to make a deposit in the bank, I don't give my wallet to somebody else to take it there, right? But that's essentially what we did with our democracy. Even considering, again, and this is crazy having produced a film in 2018 about Facebook, the role that Facebook played in the Zuckerberg-funded, basically giving money to local municipalities to help them launder political outreach in the name of election integrity. There's been some really good research on this. Some of you guys may know about this, some of you may not. But they essentially, if you look at what cities like Milwaukee and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and other places like that spent their election money on, it's to target Democrat voters. So you have election offices paying for ads and RVs and things to go after that are historically underrepresented, AKA Democratic voters. So that all happened in 2020. And so, that actually became, hey, that seems like something to ask questions about, something that seems worthy of further investigation. I think people were right to ask questions. Now, I will say, while in 2018, my book, I was trying to talk about this issue and not that many people were interested in 2020 after this, now like people cared. This is just a picture of me on a private jet, just to flex. But like hey, we care what you have to say, let's talk about this. And so now all of a sudden there's lots of media interest ahead of time. We could see this coming. And so anybody that we could, because what did we know was coming? Groups like these guys. Here are people who are paying canvassers, ballot harvesters. Ballot harvesting was legal in California. It was not legal in any other state, but it wasn't illegal in every other state, right? Only 16 states have laws against ballot harvesting. It's actually a tried and true practice. In Florida, our senior citizen population has been proven to be the most targeted group for political outreach. We actually have its own term. We call it granny farming, okay? In Texas, they have people that go out and collect all the ballots from the illegal immigrants who they've been able to register. So we knew groups like these were out there taking advantage of the vulnerabilities, okay? We also had, I think, another episode that has to be considered in the context of the 2020 election, and that's all the George Floyd protests, okay? Because what did that do? Is that essentially said any instance of, the bias became default towards the idea of racial oppression, right? I mean, cities like Tallahassee painted a Black Lives Matter mural in streets. Anything because of violence, because of the threat of violence, because of the concern in the video that showed, unfortunately, bad things happening. We saw protests, we saw unrest, and so I think we saw a collective level of political fealty and a willing to sort of resign and an unwillingness to stand up and say, hey, that's actually not racist. So Jane said that I have 4 children. That's true. So my wife and I are actually foster parents and adoptive parents. And so I have had multiple black children in my home. In fact, when our first foster placement was a little girl named Ashlyn. And so a buddy of mine, because I had 2 small children at home, like 6 months and a newborn, I would occasionally go and get a beer with a buddy of mine at this pizza place. And if you have a newborn child, you keep them in their car seat, and you go to a restaurant, you have to get a high chair, right? And you have to turn over the high chair, and you sit the thing there. Well, I got to this pizza restaurant with my small black child, and I asked for a high chair, and the restaurant said, we don't have any, they're all in use. We will give you one when another one comes available. So okay, cool. So I sat down, had a drink with my friend, and I saw a family get up in the high chair. I was kind of eyeing this high chair, and I saw the high chair go to a different table, and not my table. So, okay, I called up hostess over, and I said, hey, I remember me, I'm the guy that asked for the high chair, and I just saw that you gave the high chair to somebody else. And I just kind of motioned to my, foster child, and I was like, and I just thought, after we'd reelected Obama a second time, we'd kind of be past some of this stuff. Now, and the hostess was horrified. Now, I was just kidding. Didn't really think I'd been racially oppressed, right? I just have a terrible sense of humor and a willingness to exploit situations. But, so that wasn't racism, okay? But some of the stuff that the George Floyd era made us think was racism also wasn't racism, right? It's not racist to say, no, people should be expected to cast a ballot without us going and hand delivering and paying political operatives to do that. People should be expected to cast a ballot and have to show ID. Right? The separation from the voter and the integrity measures went out the window, often in the name of trying to protect people's feelings from feeling like they're racist, and that was one of the major dynamics that impacted the results as well. So, and all that happens, and then So the votes come in, all kinds of crazy stuff happens in 2020, and then we see this video, we see Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, say, "We did it, Joe." And all of a sudden, the machine shifted. Do you guys remember that leading up to the election, it doesn't matter where you looked, you would see a scroll on ESPN, you would see social media ads, you would say, "Hey, we're going to conduct this election in an unprecedented way." So that means it may take longer than usual for us to get the results. That's okay. That means it's working as it's expected. Like we were told, that doesn't matter where you looked. We were told, we were conditioned that this thing should happen. And then as soon as Kamala Harris declares victory, what happened to any allegation, reporting on, or a possible story about election irregularities? It was shut down. It was censored like it was a story about Hunter Biden's laptop, right? So it was any story we would write, it would get flagged by Google or Facebook as being misinformation. So once again, the information was actively suppressed. And so, that's what's prevented, I think, an honest assessment. That's what prevented an honest assessment in real time of that situation, okay? Now, since then, this happened. January 6th. So that took it from not just being misinformation, now if you talk about election integrity or election fraud, you're a terrorist. You're considered a threat to the country. So let's talk about suppression of speech and what's stopped an honest and important assessment of these issues from being fully vetted. You've got a media that's unwilling to do anything about it, and you've got a culture that says if you're looking at voter fraud, you're a racist or somebody that wants to cause an overthrow of the government. You're attempting to foment a coup. Does anybody know anybody that was at the January 6th rally? Yeah, I know many people. And let me tell you what they're not. Terrorists. Let me tell you what they're not. Trying to underthrow the government. Well, they're trying to protect the government. They're trying to ensure, and they would say that the media narratives that have surrounded that event are dishonest at best and intentionally being deceptive at worst. Right? But the point is that's another dynamic that impacts our ability to talk about election integrity, and we need to be able to have honest conversations about it because what's coming up in a month, okay? Now, we've seen some reporting on things like 2,000 Mules, Dinesh D'Souza's film. I don't know if you've seen that. So I think one of the best things that he did, I actually was on a TV panel with Dinesh D'Souza that I think will air on TBN, the Trinity Broadcast Network, sometime this month. So we got a chance to talk about his findings. We've actually done some analysis that's similar to 2,000 Mules, and what it shows is not just that the ballot harvesters will be able to kind of go back and forth, but the location of where they put the drop boxes, which if you think about it are like the least secure way to collect ballots, right? We're gonna have no oversight, we're gonna have no monitoring, we're gonna have no connection between the voter and the ballot itself. And so what we actually did is we looked and said, hey, well, where were these drop boxes actually located? And just for a fun fact, in the Democratic presidential primary in 2020, like, hey, where are we gonna put these drop boxes? Where are we gonna put these things that are meant to protect America's health? 19 of the 20 drop boxes they put in precincts that went heavily to Joe Biden. And then after that, they added another 17 for the general, and 15 of the 17 that they added went also to precincts that heavily benefited, like Joe Biden, like 80%. None of them went to precincts that were pro-Trump. So the point is, like, even things like where they strategically decided to put things like drop boxes is that fraud? Or is that just rigging the system in an intentional way? So those are all things that I think like we have to have an honest conversation about. But none of those are things that talk about dominion, right? And talk about some of the things that you heard in the aftermath of the election. And so here's why I'm worried that next month will be worse, because of this stat. So we've got people running for office that are like running for governor of certain states, running for Senate in certain states, running for the Secretary of State to be the top election official, who have said that they're unwilling to concede based on the results of the election. So love her or hate her, but Carrie Lake is the woman that's running for governor in Arizona. So yeah, look, I think she does a lot of things incredibly well. She's an excellent communicator. Yeah. But during her primary, when it would look like she was losing, she started talking about voter fraud. She said we outvoted the fraud. And look, there was some weird stuff that happened in Arizona, right? They like ran out of ballots in certain places. But I just think we're up for a potentially kind of really weird scenario. She's running against the Secretary of State in Arizona, who is the top elections official. So she's running against somebody whose job it is to certify the election. And she's saying, well, I might not be willing to concede. The guy that's running for Secretary of State of Arizona has said he's not going to concede if he loses, right? And he cites 2,000 mules like during debates. I'm just saying we're in a weird time. And if we have 60%, if we have like 500 election officials or 500 candidates who are saying they're not going to concede, it just shows you the reason we have got to restore confidence in America's elections. We have to restore confidence in integrity. We have to restore confidence in the accuracy. And we have to be willing to have hard conversations about true things. And so that's, I guess, my biggest takeaway is, you guys, we all have a role to play. So what can be done? I think we can talk about real problems with actual solutions. That means being honest about voter fraud, but being honest about like the real instances. Look, and it's not hard to find the real things. New Jersey conducted its first ever all-mail election in May of 2020. In July, it had 3 political candidates arrested for stealing ballots out of mailboxes. I mean, this thing is everywhere. You had election judges in Philadelphia just get sentenced to jail. I mean, it's there. But those are the things I think we need to talk about with actual proof. And we need to talk about the voter rolls and the errors they contain and be willing to stand up to people that say, oh, you're just trying to take rolls off of the thing because you're racist. You're not racist. You care. You shouldn't apologize for caring. But that racism is going to be an allegation that comes. And so it's your job and it's our job to redirect it. I told you about that first child that I had that I got to make my Obama joke to at the pizza place when I was getting a beer. We adopted her. And so this is my daughter, Ashlyn. And so I just think, like, you guys are good people. It's all for the government check. Don't give me applause. No, it's fine. If you guys haven't figured out how to turn your dependents into earners, you're doing it wrong. I'm just telling you right now. Okay? But, no, she, like, people would say, because I'm a white Republican male that wrote a book about election fraud, that I'm probably a racist. And I would just say that, those are all things that you might face as well. And I think we have to be willing to, post George Floyd, post January 6th, stand up and have honest conversations about real things. Because the reality is, and you guys know this better than anybody, you've seen the stakes of what can happen when a government doesn't reflect the will of its constituents. And elections are the only way to change that. So I thank you for having me here tonight to talk to you about that, talk about some of the real issues, and just I want to say thank you for continuing to stand up in the face of like unrelenting opposition. Thank you guys very much.
Okay, so would you talk a little bit about the influence of hiring Congress people's family members and how that influences things?
Absolutely. So, basically, if you want to get something done, there's law. You can't just like give somebody cash, right? You could, but it's bribery, and you might go to prison. So the legal way to bribe somebody would be to hire their family member and pay them. Why do you think China has done that with Hunter Biden, right? What do you think? And it's actually part of their strategy. In China, it's called elite capture, where their job is to form business relationships or personal relationships with members of people's families. But companies have been doing it for years. There was a Speaker of the House, another guy, but basically his son worked at a record store. Maybe not somebody that the family bragged about at Christmas parties. Dad's a Speaker of the House, son works spinning vinyl. And then when the dad became Speaker of the House, the son became a lobbyist. And his client portfolio skyrocketed. And so, we see that all the time, is that companies will hire the family members of, Chelsea Clinton got a job working for NBC News, with no media background whatsoever, right? Because they thought that Hillary was going to be the president of the United States. Why do you think Bill Clinton got paid? So family members are routinely seen, and that's one of the reasons why the Government Accountability Institute, we actually regularly press for not just financial disclosures for the political candidates themselves, but for their family members. Because, look at Paul Pelosi, right? Paul Pelosi, you guys, this is your backyard. Paul Pelosi's out there when he's sober, making stock trades left and right, and, Nancy's like, oh, that's his money, it's not my money. maybe that's how your marriage is. It's not how my marriage is. So yeah, I think that's absolutely a vehicle by which. No, exactly right. And we've looked at it. In her son was involved with some of these marijuana companies as well. While she's out there, kind of pushing for the expansion of it. No, we've looked into that. That's right.
So a couple questions about investigations that do or do not happen. One is a question from the audience. Do you know whatever happened to the investigation that the two researchers who exposed the Clinton Global Foundation IRS tax fraud issues? Do you know anything about that?
Did they get suicided?
Well, that would be one way to complete
no,
it.
So I guess I don't know which two researchers.
I don't know, but
specifically.
But the other question about that is we don't hear about law enforcement following up and investigating, like for instance the 2000 mule problems.
No, so that's actually that's a great point. And when my book first came out, I actually spoke to a group called the Republican National Lawyers Association, and it was their national convention. And so I had multiple people, because they were lawyers, they were judges, they were prosecutors. They came up to me and they said, "Listen, like, your issues are correct and accurate, but guess what? I don't have the budget or time for in my office." Right? I mean, your job as a judge or prosecutor or the law enforcement official, their job is to prosecute violent crimes. In fact, in my book, we have a detailed story of Broward County, which is South Florida. They did an in-depth, they found a ring of voter fraud that was happening with 3 different political candidates, all African-American Democrats. And they had the evidence, they had witness testimony, they had everything. But there was the state attorney in that region had formerly been in the legislature and was planning on running for statewide office that fall. And the reality is if you are a Democrat with statewide aspirations, let me tell you how you don't garner a ton of political support: by prosecuting African-American Democrats for voter fraud. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that they just don't have the time or resources. It's actually, Jane has spoken, I think, passionately about welfare fraud and abuse. And actually I spoke to a group in Minnesota about welfare fraud, and they get very frustrated as well, because like they will find people wasting thousands of dollars on EBT or fraud like that. But then law enforcement just doesn't rank as high as the other types of problems that they're going to see. And oh, by the way, law enforcement resources are down dramatically since the Black Lives Matter movement. I think retirements are up over 15%, recruitment's down over 15%. So you combine a lack of law enforcement resources with where do we want to put our priorities, and a lack of political will, and I think that's sort of what happens.
Eric, is there any evidence that real-time fraud has been addressed at all, like in terms of the counting?
So I guess I don't know what we mean by real-time fraud.
I mean, like, people saying, oh, looks like we need this many more votes at 10 o'clock.
Yes, in fact. So there was just, this is kind of crazy, but so this guy just went to prison again. But so there's a former member of Congress named Ozzie Myers. He was actually one of the members of Congress that got caught up in the AbScam scandal back in 1980. And so the AbScam scandal was basically like the FBI decided we're going to go around and we're going to dress up as Arab sheiks, and we're going to bribe members of Congress, we're going to bribe local officials like very overtly to say, hey, we'd like to get this thing, here's $50,000. And they had this guy, Ozzie Myers, on video taking $50,000 in cash, and they said to him, like, hey, spend it wisely, and he's like, with pleasure. And then he was summarily booted out of Congress and went to prison. Guess what he did as soon as he got out of prison? He started a political consulting firm.
Of course he did.
And so what he did as a political consulting firm, he committed election fraud. So he bribed these judges, and 100% he would drive the judge, so these candidates would hire him. He would hire the judges whose job it was to count the ballots, and he admitted, no, absolutely, we'd be monitoring. So, okay, this candidate's up, this candidate's down, so we need to put more ballots here. And oh, by the way, guess how they did it? They created hundreds of fraudulent voter registrations, so they knew they had the resources essentially, and they knew where they needed to spend it at that time. So that's the short answer. The longer answer is, other than like firsthand testimony of people that have been caught and admitted, it's almost impossible to calculate the actual toll of election fraud, because once a ballot gets cast that's fraudulent, you can't tell, right? I mean, like a fraudulent ballot looks just like a real ballot, And once it's separated from the voter, there's no way to know. So that actually makes even reversing the outcomes of elections more challenging. And I don't know if you guys don't want to do math this late on a Tuesday, but essentially, it's not enough to say, hey, we found 400 flawed registrations, and this election was only decided by 200 votes. Like, we should do another election. Because you can't prove that every one of those 400 people voted in that election specifically because of undervoting and things like that. So it's almost impossible to overturn an election because of that reason.
One of our audience members asks, he says, how does the FBI cease to exist as a political arm? Do you want to talk about the concept of
I mean, not in
agencies?
public, so I love the FBI. Yeah, I would say that, so actually a colleague of mine has written a book that I would highly recommend. His name is Seamus Bruner, and the book is called Compromised. And it essentially exposes the ways in which high-level FBI officials were compromised and used to perpetuate part of the Russia hoax and the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton dynamics, and how like Robert Mueller and James Comey have business dealings and just connections to Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's very well researched. It's very thoroughly done. So I would say, unfortunately for the FBI, we continue to see like real problems. And oh, by the way, we now had the FBI admit recently that what happened, that they lied about the validity of the Hunter Biden laptop, right? Which I think gave the media organizations and social media companies the legitimacy or the plausible deniability to say, all right, fine, we're going to actively suppress it. And I just saw this today, one of the FBI agents who voted to suppress the, or like helped give the rationale to suppress the laptop, is an active Democrat political campaign donor. So, yeah, I mean, those are the kind of things that shouldn't happen, can't happen, and only erodes faith in American institutions.
Okay. I have a couple of questions kind of turning towards California for a minute. What do you think about the DMV voter mode or registration stuff?
That thing's a mess. Do you guys know what she's talking about?
Yeah.
So, it's a couple of things. So number one, let's just say this. One of the biggest victims of how vulnerable and weak election integrity measures are in states like California actually are illegal immigrants or immigrants in general. So, and this is sort of an interesting dynamic. So because Democrats fight to keep laws weak, then illegal immigrants might end up actually voting in elections and not knowing that they're committing a crime, which actually should get them deported. Or even if you're an immigrant but you're not a legal non-citizen, if you cast a ballot, that is a capital offense. Like, you go back to where you came from, your process starts over. And so, I mean, there's lots of stories about people who just didn't know. And by the way, especially in cities like San Francisco and other places in California where it is legal, right, to cast a ballot if you are a non-citizen in certain local elections. That's actually one of... This canceled it? Well, no, not in federal elections. No, not in federal elections. So in Chicago and other municipalities... Okay, so... So in other, okay, so I probably, it may not be the case in San Francisco, but in Chicago and other municipalities, it is possible that non-citizens can cast ballots in local elections. And oh, by the way, one of the things we talk about in the book, so the guy that is the head of the DNC, or was the head of the DNC, a guy named Tom Perez, was an Obama Justice Department official and in charge of things like elections, okay? And so before he became an Obama Justice Department official, he worked for a nonprofit called Casa de Maryland, which was essentially like an Acorn-type organization in Maryland. And their number one issue was expanding the voting rights of non-citizens. So the point is, it gets very blurry. And all that to say, so you got people, to the question about the ID, you got people that when you can be given a driver's license and you can register to vote when you get your driver's license, and the law does not permit the DMV official from telling them not to register to vote. And so I think that's an example of a vulnerability that should be clarified, should be supported, but doesn't, and it only ends up exploiting and I think weakening the citizenship prospects and the lives of people that the Democrats allegedly are in favor of.
Could you explain a little bit about what these behested payments are? It seems like a really kind of a big, juicy thing in California based on who's getting money.
I feel like I'm in a final exam. Yes, so you told me to talk about elections. Now you're talking to me about Gavin Newsom's piggy bank, which is crazy. So do you guys know about this behested payment stuff? Yeah, so you know how you guys would know about the behested payment stuff? If you listen to the Drill Down podcast, okay? Again, it's thedrilldown.com. So California is unique and distinct in the sense that so Gavin Newsom can say, hey, here's like a cause I care about, right? Like I want to see healthcare stuff expanded, or I want to see this thing. And so companies can actually make essentially we will give money for this. So private companies can make donations to causes or initiatives that politicians say are important to them. And California is unique that way. It's one of the only states in which that can happen. And what I think it actually underscores, and obviously then they're in a position to then be beneficiaries of larger, when Gavin Newsom makes a policy, which it did, that this healthcare company that decided to donate to my initiative, you're now going to get the contract to administer this thing. And it actually speaks to the larger point that I think people like liberty-minded people need to be aware of, and that's this. A lot of people think that big government and big business are necessarily in opposition with one another. But what we've spent the last decade talking about at the Government Accountability Institute is that the opposite's true, right? Big government and big business loves big government because big government will raise the barrier to entry to startup or competition, and the government becomes like the big business's best client, right? I mean, talk about welfare. That I told you that Steve Bannon tried to get me fired one time. This is why. We produced a special for Sean Hannity's TV show about EBT fraud and how rife for corruption and how much waste was involved there. And in fact, the COVID only exacerbated that issue. You may have seen the most egregious example of pandemic fraud in history was just exposed in Minnesota, in which $250 million of money that was supposed to go to feed needy kids was found out to just have been lied about and stolen. And so you had these media entities, like this guy runs a website, and because of, it's a crazy story, but basically he made up the fact that he started a feeding program, and the guy runs a website and was claiming to be feeding 1,500 kids a day, 7 days a week, and so getting money from the federal government for it, right? And so multiple people were in on this party. It ended up adding up to $250 million. Sort of insane, right? The point is that stuff exists. And so we're like, well, how come we don't have tighter controls? How come we don't have more accurate information on? Yeah, well, how'd they get caught? That's exactly, no, she's right. There was literally this video. And in fact, it was a rival blogger who, another Somalian or an Ethiopian immigrant who ran a rival website. He's like, hey, on this guy's website, I'm not telling you what to do, but oh, by the way, these guys are running this is a wedding video where there's literally a cart laden with gold. They were flaunting their wealth and stuff. So that's exactly right. So they wouldn't have caught it with the things. And so what we did in this TV special is hey, how come we don't have tighter incentives, right? How come people don't do a better job of making sure that only people that should be beneficiaries of the program are beneficiaries of this program? And the reason is because the people that make money off the program, like the vendors, the people that sell their food to Walmart, the people that sell their soda to Walmart, that then the people with welfare cards buy, they don't care if the person that's buying it with welfare card is a legitimate user or not. They get paid regardless. So the bigger the programs get, the more money these big businesses get. And so, the behested payments is just an example of perverse incentive structures. If no one's incentivized to stop it, it's not going to stop. And typically it's not going to stop because the only person that loses is the American taxpayer.
Before we return to issues of election, do you want to say anything about corruption and green energy, Eric? I know that's an entire subject unto itself. But.
I will just say this. I think it's really fascinating that here I am in the Bay Area, the electric vehicle capital of the world, and every time I come here, I get a dang Dodge Charger as a rental car. What's that about? Where are these Teslas and things I hear about all the time? So we just did a podcast on this, but to the point about the corruption, there's a big push for electric vehicles, and people think that the big push, and California, I think you guys now said it, as of 2035, you will no longer sell gas-powered vehicles. How many of you will then be moving by 2035? Right. Well, not only is there not enough lithium to do it, by the way, do you know where a lot of the lithium that will come from to build those batteries? Well, it can come from China. There's a mine in Nevada called Lithium Americas, right? It's a lithium mine in Nevada called Lithium Americas. Guess who owns that mine? Well, you're close. You guys always get ahead of me on this stuff. It's my fault for asking questions. I should learn. So, yeah, it's a Canadian company. It actually owns Lithium Americas, but the largest shareholder of this Canadian company is a Chinese company. So you've got American lithium being extracted by a company that's owned by Canadians whose largest shareholder is Chinese. And it just speaks to, when you think about green energy technology, specifically electronic vehicles or electric vehicles, it's a sham, right? I mean, I support anybody that wants to save money on gas by getting an electric vehicle, but what do you do with those electric vehicles? You have to plug them in, right, and to recharge them. And so when you recharge them, where does that power come from? Fossil fuels, it's natural gas, right? And so, and actually, solar power, and solar, look, I support all of the above, right? But let's just be honest about something. When Barack Obama got elected in 2008, this also is in the book Throw Them All Out, and we had all this stimulus money that we're going to give to, like, hey, you got a green energy thing, we want to fund anything that's going to help lift American economy. You know, you guys may remember the term shovel-ready projects, right? In Tallahassee, Florida, where I live, the shovel-ready project we funded was, and we made the news for this, it was a turtle tunnel. So we had this highway, and we changed the highway, because it was like this lake and there's another part of the lake. So we changed, this is true, we changed the highway to make a bridge so that turtles could cross from one side of the lake to the other. And we spent like tens of millions of dollars on that. So that's bad, but it's not as bad as what happened for the green energy money that came out of the Obama era stimulus. 90% of the money for green energy stimulus under Obama went to Obama bundlers, okay? And it funded things that was unproven technology, not because the technology was good, but because the person backing it was connected. So guess what happened when all these technologies failed, like Solyndra, right? So then guess what happened? The technology failed, the companies went bankrupt, and who came in and bought up that technology on the cheap? China, right? And the solar panels, like the vast majority of solar panels are manufactured in China. So it's unfortunate. It's a tension, because on some level you'd love America to be leading in green energy stuff, but the way we do it doesn't seem to be based on like what technology makes the most sense. It seems to be based on which political hack are we most connected to or in bed with. I mean, who are the people that are in charge of, like, who's Biden's green energy senior advisor? John Podesta, who was the Clinton aide, right? And who, by the way, guess where a lot of the money to the Clinton Foundation came from? Miners. So you've got like these mining interests, and so it's just this kind of weird confluence. And then you've got this kind of China-California climate initiative, this partnership with the University of California. So China is actually going to have an electronic vehicle manufacturing plant in Lancaster, California. And it's in a partnership with this thing that Gavin Newsom's fronting. They're the ones that actually came up with the idea that we should sunset selling fossil fuel cars a month before Gavin Newsom made that declaration. So, yeah, I mean, Florida's great. You guys should really think about it. Yeah.
Right. And by the way, what Eric just rattled off the top of his head is why you have to listen to the drill down. Do you hear the depth of this guy's awareness about all this stuff? Eric, do you have the energy for a couple more?
I'm afraid to tell you no, Jane.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I
mean, the question is, do they have the energy? Like, you know, it's like,
should we ask him a couple more questions? Yes? Okay. There's some question about integrity in terms of who's counting the vote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it the SEIU? Who's counting the vote, and what impact does that have on the integrity? And also, we want these laws to be changed, but it seems like the people in charge have a vested interest in keeping things kind of how they're going. So what's your hope about that?
So I think that this is why I think being honest and having honest conversations about like what are real things and what are not real things, right? And so real things I think include the analysis of the voter registration rules. And then, yeah, like what kind of training should be done in terms of who counts the votes? Are they political appointees? Are they not? And then what are the laws in place that dictate those terms? George Soros started a thing called the Secretary of State Project back in 2004, I believe, in which he intentionally tried to put people in place that would be like more liberal in terms of their mindset and more lenient in terms of the policies that, because they have decisions about, or they have control over what policies, what laws are in place for elections. So I guess to me, I mean, you guys have people here from the California Election Integrity Project. They do an amazing job, and I've spoken with the woman who works there as well on numerous occasions. I guess what I would say is the people that count the votes matter, but that means engaging at a local level. So getting involved with your supervisor of elections office in Florida. It's called the supervisor election. I'm not sure what it's called in California, but you know, volunteer, and like while we all kind of get sucked into this presidential, you know, the political, like, oh, is DeSantis going to run? Is Biden going to be replaced by Kamala Harris? Like, so much media attention goes to the national level stuff. But the reality is it's the secretaries of state, it's the supervisors of elections, right? It's the county commissions. They're the ones that make decisions that ultimately impact the integrity of local elections. This is actually the best thing about American elections is they're decentralized. So it makes it harder to rig an entire national thing because everyone's done at a local level.
Thank you, Eric, so much for doing the essential research that the media is not doing. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Eggers.
Thank you for watching our presentation. Please like and subscribe to our channel to get updates on new speakers, and consider joining the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley. You can do so at our website. If you don't want to join, but want to support the principles of American liberty, you can make a tax-deductible donation via our website. The links are in the description. Thank you again, and stay free.